Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming to my talk. My book is entitled What the Emperor Built, Architecture and Empire in the Early Ming, and it was published in 2020 with the University of Washington Press. The book analyzes the empire-wide construction projects of Zhu Di, who reigned from 1402 to 1424 as the Yongle Emperor of the Ming Dynasty. Yongle was one of the greatest imperial builders in all of Chinese history. His largest and most ambitious project was the imperial capital in Beijing, established only a few decades after his father, the Hongwu Emperor, had built the first Ming Dynasty capital in Nanjing. At the center of the new capital was the magnificent palace now known as the Forbidden City, which became the locus of imperial power in China for the next 500 years. For the structural frames of the buildings in Beijing, Yongle ordered logs of Nanmu, a dense hardwood, to be extracted by the hundreds of thousands from old-growth forests in the southwest part of his empire. Only one monumental Nanmu hall survives from this time, and that is the sacrificial hall at Yongle's tomb, just north of the capital. While the construction of Beijing was underway, Yongle was also building temples dedicated to the Taoist deity Zhenwu in the Wudang Mountains, a sacred range in Hubei province. In addition, the emperor was dispatching craftsmen to construct Gautama Monastery, a palatial Buddhist temple in the northern Sino-Tibetan frontier. He also patronized a modest temple dedicated to the Bodhisattva Guanyin in present-day eastern Russia. Taken as a whole, these sites reveal the massive scope of Yongle's architectural ambitions and demonstrate how his sense of empire, his approach to emperorship, and his imperial legacy took shape in built space. In my talk today, I will summarize for you the main content and arguments of each of the 4 chapters of my book. The first chapter is entitled Perfecting the Past, the design and construction of the northern capital. In the 11th month of the 18th year of his reign, or 1420, Yongle ceremoniously announced to all under heaven the completion of the palace, which was later known as the Forbidden City, in his new northern capital, Beijing. He invited his ministers to the most illustrious building in the palace, the Hall of Revering Heaven, and banqueted them in celebration. Upon imperial order, 3 of Yongle's most loyal officials composed a lengthy encomium of the new imperial capital in which they praised the emperor's sage-like virtue and described in rich detail the splendor of the imperial palaces. Yongle basked in the glory of his new capital, the materialization of his ambitious imperial vision, and a symbol of power, prestige, and moral redemption within his numinous empire. Prior to becoming Yongle's capital, Beijing had already served as the capital of the Mongol-ruled Yuan dynasty. When Yongle's father, the Hongwu Emperor, founded the Ming Dynasty, he moved the capital away from the Mongol power base to the south in what is now Nanjing. In 1394, Hongwu enfeoffed his young son, the future Yongle Emperor, as the Prince of Yan in the area of the former Mongol capital. The Prince of Yan's palace was constructed directly atop the remains of the Yuan Palace and followed much of its lavish design. Yongle came to power after usurping the throne from his nephew, Zhu Yunwen, the Jianwen Emperor, during a bloody 3-year civil war. This involved not only the burning of large sections of the Nanjing Imperial Palace, with Jianwen inside, but also the violent slaughter of Jianwen's loyal officials, friends, and family members. Soon after Yongle took the throne from his nephew in 1402, he began discussing the issue of transferring the Ming capital back up to the north. By moving the capital away from the south, Yongle could distance himself from the troubling event of his usurpation, in which he burned down the Nanjing palaces with his nephew inside. He could also return to his former fief as the Prince of Yan, where he had already lived for more than 2 decades. Only 1 year after he ascended the throne, Yongle changed the name of his former fief to northern capital, Beijing, in distinction to his father's southern capital, or Nanjing. In doing so, he established the city's importance within the political geography of his empire, even though the main capital officially remained in Nanjing for 20 more years. Yongle deliberately modeled the architecture in his new capital on that of his father. Ideologically speaking, this act gave built expression to filiality and continuity while disguising nepoticide and disruption. Practically speaking, it greatly facilitated the planning process because most of the methodological basis for the designs of the palaces and ritual buildings had already been painstakingly worked out under Hongwu. In many respects, the palace in Beijing was a mirror image of that in Nanjing. The scale of both palatial cities was the same, approximately 750 meters east to west and 950 meters north to south. Both cities could be divided horizontally into 2 parts of roughly even size, and vertically along 3 north-south axes. The layout of the main halls in the Beijing Palace City were identical to those in Nanjing. Even various idiosyncrasies of the Nanjing Palace City were transplanted to Beijing. Yongle distinguished his capital from that of his father by obtaining the highest possible quality construction materials. The most commonly used material was standard gray brick, employed everywhere from walls to plinths to floors. These bricks were produced in kilns in Shandong. The most valuable type of brick were the so-called gold bricks. These were produced in kilns in Suzhou. Gold bricks were exclusively used to pave the floors of the most illustrious halls in the palaces. The stone used for the palace was mainly quarried approximately 70 kilometers southwest of Beijing. While the roof tiles were created in or near the capital. The most valuable construction material was the wood used for the timber frames of the buildings. This was obtained in Sichuan, more than 1,800 kilometers from Beijing. It was shipped down the Yangtze River, then up the Grand Canal, and finally via the Tonghui River into the capital, a process which took several years. According to the official records, the construction of Beijing began in the 11th month of the 14th year of the Yongle reign, or 1416, and was completed in the 11th month of the 18th year, or 1420. This has led to the incorrect assumption that the city was built in only 4 years. In reality, at least a decade later, craftsmen and laborers had begun making the preparations for its construction by felling trees, quarrying stones, firing ceramic roof tiles, hauling bricks, pounding earthen foundations, and fabricating the parts of the timber frame halls. Historical records testify that the number of workers involved in the building of Beijing was enormous, totaling 300,000 skilled craftsmen and 1 million other laborers. The fact that the resources, both human and material, required to build the new capital came from many different corners of the country represented the prosperity of Yongle's realm. The high degrees of preparation and organization involved in the construction of the capital likewise spoke to Yongle's great capability as a ruler. As for what the buildings in Yongle's capital looked like, I showed that they embody a brand new architectural style, far more simplified and standardized than the architecture of previous periods. On the one hand, this new architectural style was a result of the practical concerns of the master craftsmen, who had to build structures more quickly and efficiently during the decades of non-stop construction of the imperial capitals, that is Nanjing and Beijing, in the early decades of the Ming Dynasty. On the other hand, because this architectural style flourished under Yongle's patronage, it also had to represent and transmit his authority, as it was he who assumed the ultimate responsibility for its creation. The architectural style in which the buildings of the new capital were constructed possessed an overarching sense of order and uniformity that communicated the message of a strong and centralized power, controlled by a moral and capable ruler. I thus argue that the architecture in Yongle's capital ultimately served as a metaphor for the emperor himself. The glory in which Yongle basked following the completion of his capital was short-lived. In the fourth lunar month of 1421, only a few months after construction had finished, lightning struck the Hall of Revering Heaven and a fire broke out, destroying it along with the two buildings behind it. This naturally caused the whole court great shock. For Yongle, it must have been particularly upsetting, as it appeared to signal heaven's disapproval of his reign. The charred remains of these three halls served as a lasting accusation of Yongle's illegitimacy as emperor, recalling every day the palaces he burned down in Nanjing with his nephew inside. This memory was not erased until decades later, when the halls were finally rebuilt in the mid-15th century. The enormous social and economic devastation caused by the construction of Beijing eventually too faded from memory. Yet the contours of the city, its moat, walls, gates, and main halls, endured for centuries and were forever afterward associated with the Yongle Emperor. The second chapter of my book is called Great Pillars of State, the Rise and Fall of Monumental Nanmu Halls. As I just mentioned, of particular importance to Yongle when constructing the palaces and ritual buildings in his new capital at Beijing was the quality of the building materials. The material to which he devoted the most energy towards obtaining was the timber used in the structural frames of the buildings. This was called Nanmu. Large Nanmu, used for construction, only grows in the southwest of China. It is prized most of all for its size. The oldest trees, which are several hundred years old, can measure over 30 meters tall, with diameters of more than 4 meters. So these are just enormous trees. Moreover, the timbers are straight, dense, easy to work, and do not split or warp easily. They're also resistant to rot. So Nanmu was considered the ideal wood for imperial construction, so much so that it was eventually known simply as the imperial wood. The process of timber procurement began in the 4th year of the Yongle reign, or 1406. And that is 15 or so years before the palaces were completed. In that year, Yongle sent officials to the remote forests of his empire to search for high-quality timbers. Among the officials he sent, Song Li, who was sent to Sichuan, was by far the most successful. Whereas other officials either returned home or were assigned different posts not long after their initial timber-finding missions, Song Li spent more than a decade in Sichuan collecting woods for Yongle's construction projects. This is important because it shows us, the record shows us that Yongle did not necessarily have Nanmu in mind. He just sent officials to all corners of his empire to search for the best woods, and the best timbers they found were Nanmu in Sichuan province. With regard to the amount of huge Nanmu trees growing close to the waterways, the Yongle reign can be considered the period of abundance. Yet gathering and transporting the timbers was both difficult and dangerous, as we can glimpse from the 16th century illustrated record. The largest tree chunks each required between 500 and 1,000 men to haul. In the dry season, a system of dams had to be constructed to raise the water levels, and then the timber was floated out in sections from dam to dam. Because rocks that could easily damage the trunks often stuck out above the water, the haulers had to wait until the river rose high enough to float the timbers above the rocks. In the flood season, it was basically impossible to transport the wood because the currents were too strong. Once the timbers had floated to the large rivers, they were bundled together in groups of 80 to form rafts, each of which was escorted by 10 sailors and 40 laborers to Beijing. A popular saying in Sichuan province expressed that if 1,000 men went into the forest to collect timbers, only 500 came out, indicating just how difficult and dangerous this process was. Originally, all the grand halls in Yongle's Beijing would have been constructed out of Nanmu. But today, unfortunately, only one monumental Nanmu building still stands from the Yongle period. And that is, as I mentioned before, the sacrificial hall at Yongle's tomb, which was called Changling, this building here. One of the most distinctive characteristics of the building, whose interior you're looking at now, is the lack of ornamentation. As we can see here, the building was constructed in a way to celebrate the natural beauty of the wood. Instead of being painted with lacquer, as was traditional in Chinese architecture, the columns and beams in this hall have been finely planed and applied with wax, indicating that the wood was considered too beautiful and special to cover up. As a result, the formal qualities of the structure are brought to the fore. The massive unadorned pillars and beams in the sacrificial hall evoke the sacred power of the natural world that created them. At the same time, they speak to the earthly power of the Yongle emperor, who was able to gather the timbers from the edge of his empire, bring them back to his new capital, and to construct great halls out of them. In the architecture of the sacrificial hall, we thus see the joining of the natural and imperial powers. Nanmu procurement continued throughout the Ming dynasty. A great spike in the history of Nanmu procurement occurred in the Jiajing and Wanli reigns. This was precipitated by the destruction by fire of many large-scale palace buildings in Beijing. Our primary textual sources reveal that by this time, Nanmu was clearly considered the ideal building material for the great state halls. At the same time, the primary sources document an increasing level of anxiety over having to reconstruct these monumental buildings out of Nanmu, because the majority of large trees growing close to the waterways had already been cut down in the Yongle reign. For the first major reconstruction carried out under Jiajing in the mid-16th century, enough large Nanmu materials were obtained to rebuild the main hall of the ancestral temple on the same scale as Yongle's sacrificial hall at his tomb that we just saw. Here we can see one of the large Nanmu columns inside the ancestral temple. But by the early 17th century, during the Wanli reign, Nanmu timbers were becoming so scarce that only buildings of a much smaller scale could be built entirely out of Nanmu. An example of this is the Great Compassionate Hall of Pure Jewels, a Buddhist hall now located in Beihai Park to the west of the Forbidden City, which is far smaller than Yongle's sacrificial hall and Jiajing's ancestral temple. In the second month of the 18th year of the Kangxi reign, this is in the Qing dynasty now, the dynasty that succeeded the Ming, the Hall of Revering Heaven, the main hall at the front of the central axis in the Forbidden City, which was now renamed the Hall of Supreme Harmony, was once again destroyed, this time by an earthquake. Officials were dispatched to Sichuan to survey the forests for Nanmu, but their findings were not good. It was reported that the large timbers only grew in the distant and remote valleys of tall mountains, where even the locals had not set foot and into which hardly any paths even led. The populations in Sichuan had significantly dwindled following a series of wars in the area, and the collection of Nanmu had been incredibly taxing on them. The emperor listened to the report by his officials in which they announced that it would be impossible to collect the thousands of Nanmu timbers necessary for the reconstruction of the hall. So after hearing the report, Kangxi put a stop to the collection of Nanmu altogether and announced that the hall would be constructed out of song wood, which is pine wood instead. Although from the exterior, the pine wood pillars and beams inside the Hall of Supreme Harmony appear to be as thick as those used in the sacrificial hall in the Ming dynasty, in fact, they hide an important secret, which you can see on the right there. Unlike in the earlier Ming halls, these pillars do not comprise a single tree trunk. Rather, they were fabricated using the so-called wrapped rim method, in which one tall but thin trunk forms a central core around which several boards carved into trapezoids are arranged to create a thicker pillar. And then wooden slips are clamped together with metal rings. The columns are covered in layers of hemp cloth and finally painted with lacquer and pigment, obscuring the fact, as we can see here, that they were comprised of composite structures. So why did the craftsmen at the Hall of Supreme Harmony create larger timbers with the wrapped rim method rather than using smaller timbers? Well, on the one hand, large timber members were structurally necessary to create big buildings. And the Hall of Supreme Harmony certainly had to be big, first on account of its importance, and second because it had to maintain an appropriate sense of scale in relation to its surroundings. On the other hand, the large pillars and beams composed of smaller parts within the Hall of Supreme Harmony underscore the symbolic value that had been placed on massive pillars since the Yongle period. Finally, they reveal an important fact that is absent in the textual records, that pine trunks as thick as those of Nanmu were never found. One might assume that the allure of Nanmu would have worn off once pine wood was used for the reconstruction of the Hall of Supreme Harmony. However, this was not the case. Nanmu timbers continued to be gathered throughout the rest of the Qing dynasty, but they were much smaller in size than those used in the early Ming. Two examples of small-scale halls made out of Nanmu are the Hall of Detached Sincerity, which you see on the left from 1750, and the Hall of Great Favors, which you see on the right of 1850. From these Qing Dynasty Nanmu buildings, it appears that alongside the growing scarcity of non-timbers, although the value of Nanmu remained strong, the aesthetic of the buildings constructed out of it shifted. While the massive pillars and beams in the Ming halls were intended to awe and overwhelm the viewer with their monumentality, the Qing period halls evoke a much more intimate feel, and their elegant ornamentation invites close and careful observation. So in conclusion, Yongle initiated the practice of using Nanmu to construct the most important buildings in the Ming Empire. The massive Nanmu pillars and beams in these halls rendered signaled the extremities of the empire and Yongle's control over them. They communicated the fusion of the imperial and natural powers, thereby lending legitimacy to Yongle's rule. By constructing the great halls in his new capital out of Nanmu, Yongle set the standard for all subsequent reconstructions. This placed an enormous burden on the emperors after Yongle, because as time went on, large Nanmu trees growing close to the waterways became increasingly difficult to find and transport. The emperors and their officials were aware of this fact, and as a consequence, the Yongle period came to be considered the golden age of timber procurement. Considering the enormous difficulties involved in obtaining large timbers for construction, it is remarkable that Yongle went to such great lengths to do it in the first place. And perhaps even more astonishing, that his successors continued the practice even as the natural resources dwindled. Their actions speak to the perceived importance of Nanmu, not only as an ideal construction material, but also as a symbol of imperial power and an established practice that had to be followed, even though constructing large-scale buildings in Nanmu had only begun in the Yongle reign. In other words, this was not an ancient practice. Despite the continued desires of the emperors to obtain Nanmu for their imperial constructions, the devastating social and environmental impacts ultimately rendered the procurement of Nanmu timbers, and thus the construction of large-scale Nanmu buildings, unsustainable. My third chapter is called Becoming Zhenwu, the Imperial Turn at Mount Wudang. Between the years 1412 and 1424, as his palaces were being built in the capital, the Yongle Emperor was deeply engaged in another important architectural project, and that is the reconstruction of a great number of Taoist temples dedicated to a Taoist deity called Zhenwu on Mount Wudang, a sacred range in present-day Hubei province. According to the sacred biography of Zhenwu's life, Prince Zhenwu was born on the third day of the third month into the kingdom of quiet joy. As a young boy, he was intelligent and brave, memorizing the classics by the time he was 10. Instead of inheriting his father's position as king, Zhenwu chose to devote himself instead to Taoist self-cultivation. He left home at the age of 15, despite resistance from his parents, and he entered the Wudang Mountains to practice Taoism. And according to the myth, after 42 years, he reached enlightenment and ascended to heaven. So therefore, Mount Wudang was closely associated with this deity. During the Yuan dynasty, Taoist priests living on Mount Wudang sponsored the creation of numerous sacred sites on the mountain that corresponded to episodes in the Zhenwu legend. On the mountain's highest peak, known as Heaven's Pillar Peak, they erected a miniature bronze hall that marked the site of Zhenwu's ascendancy to heaven. At the beginning of the Ming dynasty, the temples and other sites that had dotted Mount Wudang in the Yuan dynasty lay in ruins after being destroyed in the wars that had occurred during the Yuan-Ming dynastic transition. Yongle's interest in reconstructing the temples was directly connected to Zhenwu, because he claimed that Zhenwu had aided him in his usurpation of the throne. So immediately after Yongle rose to power, he vowed to reconstruct the temples on Mount Wudang as a way to thank Zhenwu for his assistance in his usurpation. Yongle's first major building project on Mount Wudang was the reconstruction of its 4 largest temples. So you can locate them on the map. Jade Void Palace, Purple Skies Palace, Southern Cliff Palace, and Five Dragons Palace. This project officially commenced on the 9th month of the 10th year of 1412. The second major construction project was the installation in 1418 of the Golden Hall, a small-scale building made of bronze on Heaven's Pillar Peak. And this replaced the original copper hall that was built by the Taoist priests in the preceding dynasty. And to make way for Yongle's Golden Hall, he moved the bronze or the copper Yuan dynasty hall to a peak below. The third and final project on the mountain was the construction of the Quiet Joy Palace, which you can see it's actually now submerged under this reservoir here. This temple represents the Quiet Joy Kingdom, where Zhenwu was supposedly born and lived as a child. At the same time as the temples were being rebuilt, Yongle also undertook a large-scale renovation of the pilgrimage paths leading up the mountain. Following the completion of Yongle's reconstruction project, the temples on Mount Wudang achieved a newfound level of conceptual and architectural coherency. The official starting point of the pilgrimage was the massive Jade Void Palace, so that is right here, located at the base of the mountain. From there, the pilgrims would begin their ascent up the long and winding eastern mountain path. Along the way, they would stop at 2 of Wudang's most important temples, Purple Skies Palace and Southern Cliff Palace, as well as many other smaller temples, cave shrines, large rocks, and platforms. After the Southern Cliff Palace, the Eastern Path joins with the Western Path, and a very steep route leads to the summit, crowned by the Golden Hall. So you can see the convergence of the 2 paths here, and the one single path that leads up to the summit. Throughout the entire Eastern pilgrimage route, the Golden Hall, a symbol of Zhenwu's enlightenment, is visible, disappears, and then reappears in the distance, encouraging the pilgrims to persist until they reach the summit. Once at the Golden Hall, the pilgrim would come into contact with Zhenwu through a series of rituals. Here we can see the Golden Hall on the summit of Mount Wudang. Here's a closer view of that hall. And then here it is from the front. This hall eventually became an icon of Mount Wudang and of the Zhenwu cult more broadly. One reason for this was that the hall represented the site of Zhenwu's ascendance. The architectural features of the hall likely also contributed to its iconicity. This included not only the hall's uniqueness in comparison to the other relatively uniform main halls on the mountain, but also its sculpture-like qualities, including its metal material, its compact size, and its abbreviated architectural form. These attributes must have made it easier for people to hold the image of the Golden Hall in their minds, and also to reproduce it in 2- and 3-dimensional forms, which we're about to see now. So as soon as they started rebuilding the temples on Mount Wudang, Yongle and his advisors looked for signs of heaven's approval. So Yongle asked his officials who were located on the mountain, he was back in the capital, he never visited Mount Wudang, but he asked them to record any signs they saw of Zhenwu's approval of his architectural project. So any miraculous occurrences reported by his officials were then documented in the form of illustrated texts, only a few of which survive today. And then these were sent back to the emperor. The most well-known of these is the so-called illustrated record of the auspicious responses of the supreme emperor of the dark heaven of the Great Ming dynasty, which was most likely compiled between the years 1413 and 1418 by Taoist masters or court officials on Mount Wudang. So we can see here that it documents Zhenwu's appearance over the highest peak and above the Golden Hall on Mount Wudang. Another visual document is a painted hand scroll entitled Auspicious Images on Mount Taihe, which presents a much different view of the mountain. This, I've never been able to see the scroll in its entirety. Rather, I've cobbled these images together from various sources, both printed books and from the internet. So we see details of the many scenes here. So this elegant scroll probably once belonged to the emperor himself. It comprises 15 images depicting Zhenwu's manifestations above Mount Wudang in either the form of radiant multicolored clouds, or at least in one case in anthropomorphic form. It's very hard to make out here, but this is Zhenwu. In these images, magical clouds and rainbow light hover over the many sacred sites of Mount Wudang, from its largest temples to its isolated open-air altars, suggesting that all the buildings on the mountain were considered equally auspicious. After its completion, Yongle's reconstruction project was promoted through a number of different channels. A major testament to the influence of Yongle's reconstruction project is a replica of Mount Wudang on an entirely different mountain, located 1,000 kilometers away. And this was called Mount Qiyun. So this was a center of a regional Zhenwu cult. In the decades after Yongle completed his reconstruction project, Taoist priests living on this other mountain, Mount Qiyun, began to model their mountain's sacred landscape after that of Mount Wudang. So we can see from this that Yongle's reconstruction project thus helped transform Mount Wudang into a template that could be studied and copied. Around the same time that Taoist priests were recreating Mount Wudang on Mount Qiyun, miniature models of Mount Wudang were also being made. A well-known example is the bronze sculpture you see on the right, which is now in the collection of the British Museum. This sculpture depicts Zhenwu being escorted by 5 dragon kings to his apotheosis atop a craggy heaven's pillar peak capped by a golden hall. Very small here. This and similar statues of the mountain indicate that people believed the sacred power of Mount Wudang could be distilled into transportable devotional objects. The Golden Hall itself inspired several copycat projects. Beginning in the 17th century, numerous copper halls were constructed atop sacred Taoist and Buddhist mountains throughout China. In at least 4 cases, the textual records accompanying these halls explicitly reference Yongle's Golden Hall. Another after effect of the reconstruction project on Mount Wudang was the emergence in popular legends that suggested physical connections between Yongle and statues of Zhenwu. One of these legends offers an explanation for the long-haired and barefooted type of Zhenwu statue that we see at Mount Wudang and elsewhere, such as what you see on the left here. According to the story, once the Mount Wudang temples were completed, Yongle ordered craftsmen to make a statue of Zhenwu. The craftsman produced a number of images, but the emperor was not satisfied with any of them. And one by one, he beheaded, imprisoned, or banished the craftsmen. Later, the Yongle emperor heard of a skilled sculptor from Korea and summoned him to make the statue. When he arrived for an audience, when the sculptor arrived for an audience with Yongle, the emperor had just gotten out of the bath, and his hair was wet and he was barefoot. So the sculptor studied Yongle's appearance, and based on the hints that the Yongle emperor was giving him, suddenly realized that he should model his Nanmu statue on Yongle himself. So the sculptor created a sculpture of gilt bronze, and when Yongle saw it, he could not stop praising it. So the emperor even shaved off his own beard and attached it to the statue's face. This legend concludes by stating that from that point onward, Yongle was at once considered the king of humans and the god of the heavens. Despite being totally apocryphal, this legend is important because it demonstrates that in the centuries after Yongle's death, people believed that the Yongle emperor and statues of Nanmu looked alike. From this, it is possible to infer that Yongle and the real Nanmu were thought to possess other shared traits. And it would not be too much of a stretch to say that in the minds of many people, the two were somehow interchangeable. The final line in the popular legend on Mount Wudang, in which Yongle is said to be both a king and a god, is strong evidence for this claim. So in this chapter, we therefore see how the architectural project on Mount Wudang continued to shape the popular perception of Yongle well after his death. My fourth and final chapter, From Mandala to Palace, Transforming Space and Site at Gautama Monastery, concentrates on a temple out in the Sino-Tibetan borderlands known as Gautama Monastery. So this is, of course, located not in the capital, but in a very isolated mountainous region. The Tibetans consider it part of the eastern part of their country. So this is Tibet down here, and here's Gautama Monastery. It's located in a place called Ledu in Qinghai province. So Gautama Monastery took its present shape over the course of about 40 years as a series of additive constructions. In all, it received support from 4 of the first 5 Ming rulers. So here's what the monastery looks like. And it received the support of these rulers. Although imperial involvement reached its height under Yongle. During their reigns, these emperors issued many edicts to the monastery, most of which are now carved onto bilingual, in Chinese and Tibetan, stelae still located in situ. These emperors also sent craftsmen from the court to manage the construction and decoration of the Buddha halls at this monastery, as well as a great number of precious objects crafted in court workshops, which along with the buildings themselves are very well preserved. So for these reasons, Gautama Monastery is a quite extraordinary site. Gautama Monastery was founded by a Tibetan Buddhist Lama named Sanjay Tashi. Sanjay Tashi was well known in the Amdo region, this region of eastern Tibet, for having persuaded the disbanded followers of a Yuan dynasty loyalist and Ming enemy in a nearby region to submit to the Ming regime, thereby helping to stabilize the northwestern frontier, which after the fall of the Yuan dynasty had descended into political chaos. Ming dynasty imperial involvement with Gautama Monastery began in 1393 during the Hongwu reign. In this year, in 1393, Sanjay Tashi traveled from Ledu to Nanjing bearing horses as tribute to request imperial protection for his newly established temple. Understanding the Lama's important position as a peacekeeper in the Northwest, Hongwu pledged his support of his temple and granted it a new name, Gautama Monastery. This name was carved onto a signboard that still hangs from the monastery's founding hall, signifying the court's recognition. So there you see the Hongwu Emperor's calligraphy. The early architecture of Gautama Monastery had little in common with the imperial Chinese palace architectural style for which it eventually came to be known. So we can see here outlined in red that the first iteration of this monastery adopted a mandala-like plan with a central hall and 4 stupas at each of the corners. So a stupa is a reliquary, Buddhist reliquary. Yongle's first engagements with Gautama Monastery can be dated to an edict issued in the first month of the 6th year of his reign, or 1408. In the edict, Yongle appointed Sanjay Tashi's nephews, Palden Zangpo and Doyon Zangpo, to the position of abbots of Gautama Monastery. A decade passed before Yongle sent another edict to the monastery. In the second edict, dated to the first month of the 16th year of his reign, or 1418, Yongle praised the people in the Western lands for their devotion to Buddhism and bestowed a name, Jewel Light, or the Hall of Jewel Light, on a newly completed hall at the monastery. 3 months later, he sent a third edict, and this was titled, "The Stele of Gautama Monastery's Golden Buddha Image Created Under the Order of the Emperor." And this was supposed to be inscribed, according to the emperor's instructions, on a stele at the monastery, which you see here. So in the edict, Yongle explains that he bestows on the abbot of Gautama Monastery a gilt bronze statue, and this was to be housed in the new Buddha hall, the Temple of Jewel Light, which I just showed you. According to the text, composed by Yongle, this statue was miraculous, creating itself when the sculpture had temporarily left the room. Sadly, this sculpture, along with most of the other sculptures in the monastery, no longer survives. However, we can get some sense of what it looked like from a gilt bronze standing bodhisattva image now housed in the Qinghai Provincial Museum. This is one of the only sculptures that still survives from the temple. This is a magnificent sculpture in many ways, but one thing you don't see here is that cast onto the base here is the phrase "bestowed in the Yongle reign of the Great Ming Dynasty" in 3 scripts, Chinese, Tibetan, and Sanskrit. And we see an identical inscription on several other objects surviving at Gautama Monastery that Yongle sent to the temple. So for instance, this bronze cauldron incense burner, and then this other bronze incense burner, both of which were sent from the capital to the monastery. So Yongle actually applied this same kind of brand to many objects that he sent to Tibetan monasteries or gave to Tibetan lamas. And in doing so, he was projecting his imperial power throughout space and over time. A set of records of donations to the monastery documents that Yongle sent craftsmen from the imperial court to construct a third hall along the monastery's axis, and that was called the Hall of Dynastic Prosperity. Although this hall was not finished until 1427 under Yongle's grandson, Xuande, what matters for the current discussion is that it was part of Yongle's grand architectural vision for the monastery. So to understand the significance of the Hall of Dynastic Prosperity's architecture, we must consider the relationship of this building to the covered arcades and the bell and drum towers on either side of it. So here you can see that more clearly in this beautiful elevation drawing. This tripartite form has a long history in China of being employed for the highest rank buildings in imperial palaces, such as the great Hall of Enfolding Vitality of the Tang Dynasty capital. So the Tang Dynasty was from 618 to 907. But most important for the present discussion, this was actually the form adopted by the Hall of Revering Heaven, which was later, we know, renamed the Hall of Supreme Harmony. And we know this from illustrated, from paintings such as this one, early paintings such as this one. So we can see that the Hall of Revering Heaven originally had these sloped corridors and flanking storied towers. This architectural form was also an important index for palace in 2-dimensional representations, such as this famous painting here by the Song Dynasty Emperor Huizong called Auspicious Cranes. So here you can see the central hall and then just the top of the sloping towers connected to these storied corridors. Key to the significance of the representations of the structural form is the implication of the viewer's vantage point at the front and center, because it underscores the building's bilateral symmetry, one of the most fundamental design principles in Chinese architecture. In fact, with this in mind, we may even consider the possibility that the architectural form stands in for the entire palatial complex, the whole embodied in the part. The underlying message of this iconic form is that the emperor exists at the center, and therefore the center of the universe. When Yongle died in 1424, Gautama Monastery was still unfinished. The project was continued under his successors, Hongxi and Xuande. Hongxi and Xuande framed their contributions to the monastery as acts of filial piety towards Hongwu and Yongle, and as a result, Gautama Monastery took the role of a lineage temple. So we even see that in 1427, Xuande installed a tablet inscribed with the words, "Long live the emperor," in Sanskrit, Chinese, and Tibetan. And this was placed within the main hall, or this was placed within the Hall of Dynastic Prosperity, the temple's main hall. So Xuande's devotion to completing Gautama Monastery on behalf of Yongle was evidently so important to the history of the temple that it eventually entered into a myth preserved in a Tibetan language history of this region. The myth centers on the origins of a gilt bronze statue of Vajradhara, and this is one of the highest deities in the Tibetan Buddhist pantheon. This statue was purported to weigh roughly 2,500 pounds, and it was sent by Xuande to be installed as the main statue in this hall. According to the record, following the completion of the hall, all sorts of spectacular, miraculous sights, including rainbows, appeared in the sky. And then from among these rainbows, a golden statue of Vajradhara flew from the sky and landed before the hall. And we are told in the record that the Chinese people who witnessed the event took the flying Buddha to be a relic of the deceased Yongle emperor. According to the legend, they believed that Yongle had appeared in response to the pious devotion of his grandson Xuande in carrying out the completion of the architectural project. Importantly, the Hall of Dynastic Prosperity is still locally referred to as the Yongle Hall. So this story bears striking similarities to the afterlife of Yongle's Taoist architectural complex on Mount Wudang. Following the completion of both of these projects, miraculous images appeared in the sky, revealing heaven's favor. Whereas at Mount Wudang, most of the omens appeared above the Golden Hall, at Gautama Monastery, the Hall of Dynastic Prosperity served as the setting of the auspicious occurrences. Both the Golden Hall and the Hall of Dynastic Prosperity, or the Yongle Hall, enshrined statues of the primary deity to whom the site was dedicated, Nanmu in the case of the Golden Hall, and Vajradhara in the case of the Hall of Dynastic Prosperity. Therefore, these buildings can be considered the centers of sacred power at their respective sites. It is no coincidence that the Golden Hall and the Hall of Prosperity were also the most architecturally significant buildings at their respective sites. Perhaps most intriguing, just as popular legend purported that the statue of Nanmu housed in the Golden Hall was modeled on Yongle, in the story recounted just now, the Vajradhara statue inside the Hall of Dynastic Prosperity was considered to be a relic of Yongle. Both legends thus imply that Yongle and the resident deity, either Nanmu or Vajradhara, were one and the same. So in conclusion, 4 early Ming Dynasty emperors supported Gautama Monastery in succession, sending edicts, craftsmen, managers, and precious objects inscribed with Ming reign dates to this borderland temple. The motivations of the Ming rulers in supporting the monastery were to bring peace to and also to control this politically tumultuous region, as well as to use it as a lineage temple in which the lamas could pray for the long life of the dynastic line. Under Yongle, the monastery was transformed from a small-scale cluster of buildings whose iconographic and architectural programs were more closely linked to Tibet than to China, to a grand palace-like monastery that communicated intimate associations with the Ming court. In terms of the way in which Gautama Monastery was remembered, Yongle's singular architectural vision mattered more than the patronage of the other three early Ming emperors. His successors, particularly Xuande, were instrumental in this process by promoting Yongle's contributions to the monastery over their own. The image ultimately created of Yongle through his patronage of Gautama Monastery was overwhelmingly positive. He was even purported to be intertwined with Vajradhara, the highest deity in the Tibetan Buddhist pantheon, thereby reaching a near apotheosis. Gautama Monastery is thus another example of the remarkable capacity of Yongle's great construction projects to both manipulate the historical memory in his favor and to completely reshape the identity of a particular place. Okay, thank you. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much, Aurelia. That was just a dazzling presentation.
Thanks.
A summary of a groundbreaking book. We have 2 questions so far in the chat, so I'll start with those. The first is, did the non-timber pillars composed of pine for the reconstruction of the Hall of Supreme Harmony comprise the longevity of the building? And
what the longevity of the building?
Now, I'm not sure exactly what it means, but it may the last
I feel like contribute to or something.
Contribute to the longevity of the building. And then it said, in other words, from a preservation standpoint, has the pine or Nanmu proven more durable over time?
That's a really interesting question and something I haven't thought of before. I don't think so, though. I think both are equally as flammable. The only reason the pine wood structure has survived is because miraculously it hasn't burned down since the last reconstruction in 1695. But nothing's saying it can't. Actually, individual pieces of wood, like some beams and pillars inside that hall, have been replaced over time. So even in the 20th century. And interestingly, in the last kind of replacements of those individual timbers, any guesses where the wood comes from? Well, probably you can't guess, but Oregon, the United States. So that's where the large timbers, they're probably redwood then. I assume they're redwood and then sent from Oregon.
That's great. The next question we have begins with a thank you. Aurelia, thanks for your wonderful talk. Yongle's building programs that you described, the scale, the geographic reach, the procurement of materials, the building technology were extraordinary. I imagine your research process to write the book had to be equally extraordinary. Could you tell us about your process and methodology?
Yeah, sure. It's pretty difficult to study Chinese buildings because of it's hard to get access to them. So I've been to all of the buildings I wrote about many times, but that means photographing them from the outside and interior when I can, although there are lots of prohibitions, or that's not the word, but rules against photography in the interior of buildings, like you have to get special permission. So when I study structures, I have to largely rely on data and architectural drawings done by mostly students in China. So students of architectural history in China have a pretty specific training. As part of their training, they spend almost every summer in teams going with their university classes into doing field work and surveying every aspect of these buildings, taking measurements of each of the component parts. This takes months and dozens of people to do it. And then they compile that data and make drawings based on that data. So I had to rely on the drawings that my colleagues in China have made, because simply I'm not able to access those buildings and I can't do that much work. So that was part of the process. And then I also had to reconstruct the picture of these buildings based on textual records. So quite a bit of my work was textual, working with texts. especially the chapter on Nanmu. That was almost entirely reconstructed through textual references.
Next question is, why was the Forbidden City mainly constructed using gray bricks?
Oh, that's a good question. In the Ming Dynasty, you see gray bricks all over the place. Those gray bricks I showed. And that's because, I mean, the Great Wall, which you have all probably seen images of the Great Wall of China, that was also constructed in the Ming Dynasty using these gray bricks. The core of that is this pounded earth foundation, but it's faced with gray bricks. So gray bricks were produced by the, billions probably during the Ming Dynasty. Somehow the technology had become advanced during that time. I guess the gray brick, which was used to pave the floors and face the walls, just looked clean. I haven't seen an explanation beyond that. I don't think they carried any symbolic importance, but the brick technology had definitely improved by the Ming. So then you just see gray bricks everywhere.
The next question is, pine isn't known as a hardwood.
Oh.
Were the later replacements built on the same scale as the original buildings in Nanmu?
You mean the front timbers from Oregon?
I guess so, yeah.
I think Stoney wrote that question. As far as I know, I've seen some pictures of the pillars and beams inside the halls, and they're all like above the roof frame. Not the roof frame, sorry, the ceiling. All fancy Chinese buildings have a ceiling, so you can't really see up into the roof frame because it's obscured. But I've seen pictures of the interior of the roof frame, and those pillars are huge pillars, but all created with composite members. I'm not sure if those are the beams from Oregon, though, or if those beams from Oregon were left whole. Sorry, I just don't know. But it could be because of the bad quality of the pine wood that they didn't survive and had to be replaced eventually.
And then there's a follow-up question to that from someone else, asking if any of the Nanmu trees still exist in China.
Yeah, I mentioned that in my book, but I just didn't have time for it here. You can count them on your, they're like fewer than 100 or something trees, and most of them are protected now, or at least the huge ones. I think there are probably smaller ones, but these ones that are several hundred years old are protected in certain places, and they've actually been counted, so we know exactly how many there are. Not very many, unfortunately.
I'm just going to look and see if we have any raised hands, if anyone wants to speak up, and I don't see any, but I will ask for any more questions.
We do, sorry Nancy, we have one from Claire.
Claire, yeah, I see Claire giving at me. Please.
Hi, Professor Campbell, so nice to see you again. Most of what I'm kind of interested, especially with the wood, the Nanmu, kind of acquiring all the different materials, like the spectacle that the emperors kind of wanted to create, especially considering the very secret nature of the Forbidden City. Like once you're within the structures, it's a very limited crowd and audience that would be seeing these structures. I'm just interested in like considering the perspective or the large spectacle of this acquiring of all these different materials that the general Chinese population would see, kind of like we saw the prints of kind of traveling the wood everywhere, but kind of what relationship that built of the emperor with the people and how that bolstered his reputation, or was the point of acquiring, did it ever get to a point where it was just to show off that you were able to do this as opposed to just being about the materials? So more about the spectacle and people as opposed to.
Great question, and something I didn't really mention, although it's mentioned in the chapter in my book. So you're absolutely right that the Forbidden City was closed off to most people. Most people could not go in the imperial palace. Most people didn't see these buildings. But when the timbers were floated down the waterways, they would have been very visible. And records say that some of these flotillas had like butcher shops. I mean, there was like, these were like little floating cities. They described butcher shops and haircutting stations, and I think even gardens and things. So this would have been a very visible, you know, each time these buildings in the capital were reconstructed, it would have been a very visible event. So you're right that there was a certain spectacle associated with it in that regard. As for the buildings themselves, I think the emperors just really, you know, the one, not just Yongle, but the emperor subsequent to him that wanted to reconstruct these buildings out of Nanmu really had the sense that anything besides Nanmu would be inferior and not considered of imperial quality. So for them, I think it was a very personal reason, not so much associated with the spectacle of bringing them to the capital.
I had a question, actually. I was really struck as a Western medievalist, this idea that a relic comes out of the sky in the form of a sculpture.
Yeah.
It's not part of the emperor's body. It's a full-blown sculpture.
Yeah.
And so do you end up having the building serve almost as a reliquary for the relic? And do pilgrims visit it?
Really interesting question, and that unleashes a huge topic. So the conception of statues as relics, okay, it's getting complicated.
So different than the Western concept. So
that particular text is a Tibetan text. So that particular association with the statue as statue of Vajradhara identified as a relic of the Yongle emperor is Tibetan, and that I would say is a Tibetan concept. Mm-hmm. Relics in Buddha halls, that kind of hall that enshrined a statue, those weren't considered relics or reliquaries. Mm-hmm. But stupas or pagodas, I showed one of them, the white form, and you've probably all seen a pagoda with many roof eaves. Those were Buddhist reliquaries, and those did have relics inside. The relics could be many different things. They could be little bits of the Buddha's body, or people purported, you know, claimed that they were bits of the Buddha's body, or they could be little statues sometimes, or they could be little jewels or scriptures, but these were always hidden away, buried. They weren't displayed and worshipped in the same way as statues were. So this particular case is rare and a Tibetan phenomenon, I would say. Which in Tibetan texts, we often see Buddha images flying from place to place and miraculously materializing, which we also see in China. But the idea of the Buddha flying from the sky is very Tibetan and landing there. Because Buddha statues could choose where they wanted to end up. They had agency.
Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I don't see any more hands waving. It remains really for me to thank you and congratulate you again.
Thanks so much for this opportunity.
Both a wonderful book and a spectacular, very informative presentation. Thank you so much. So we can all unmute ourselves and clap aloud, I think.
Thank you all so much for attending. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Aurelia.
You're welcome. Bye. Good night, everybody.
Bye.